in 1910. The reason he hated it was he had a hard time finding any information. And the second was by a woman named Mary McCoy that covers a much broader period, but it's essentially a Marxist interpretation that takes as gospel Fidel Castro's claim that our presence at Guantanamo is illegal, in spite of the fact that there are two separate bilateral treaties that provide for the leasing arrangement, and every president from Theodore Roosevelt, certainly to George W. Bush, and I would say President Obama, has essentially affirmed our right to be there. I think the actions that I mentioned just a few minutes ago are a kind of tacit information that Guantanamo can be useful in times of serious distress. Well, shortly after I decided to consider this topic seriously, I read a brief historical essay, also by Bradley Reynolds, that lacked a unifying theme. It was published in a book called U.S. Navy and Marine Corps Bases Overseas, a rather dry book, but it did sketch Guantanamo's history from 1898 to the present. It at least told me that Guantanamo had served multiple functions over this 90-year period and had been an ongoing prominent factor in U.S.-Cuban relations. So on the basis of this rather skimpy essay, I decided that if nothing else, I could use Reynolds' article as a draft outline and a guide to the work that I would write. A major focus of my book is on the period 1934 to the present. For it was in 1934 that the United States government abrogated the Platt Amendment, but renewed the treaty concerning the lease for Guantanamo, and Franklin Roosevelt used exactly the same language that his cousin Theodore Roosevelt had dictated in 1903. Now, there are at least a couple of events affecting my research that occurred, I would say, serendipitously. Early on, a New York literary agent found out that I was doing this. I'm not sure how he discovered me, but he contacted me to offer his services and to request that I write a book proposal that he could flog with various publishing houses. This prompted me to organize my thoughts and to write what essentially became the introductory chapter to my work. Ultimately, this agent informed me that he had learned that another writer had signed a contract with a major New York publishing firm to write a history of Guantanamo, and he didn't think the commercial market would absorb two works on this subject. The other book has never materialized. The second serendipitous event was that one of the first places I went to do research was the Washington Navy Yard. And what I do whenever I plan to go to an archive is I get in touch with the head archivist before I'm coming, and I say, this is my topic and this is what I want to do. You know, is it worth coming there? And can you help me out? And that way I at least have some idea of the lay of the land before I go. Well, the archivist there, on the second day that I showed up, he had a little glint in his eye, and he sort of motioned for me to come over. And he said, Mr. Schwab, he said, I have an idea for you. And he said, but before I share my idea, he said, would you promise me that when you finish your dissertation, you will give me a copy of the dissertation for the library, and if it becomes a book, which I suspect it will, would you give us a copy of the book as well? And I said, sure, assuming you have a good idea for me, which I think you do. And he said, well, he said, do you have time and money to travel and do research? And I said, yes, I have some grants from the university. And he said, well, he said, I think if you would go to various presidential libraries, perhaps starting with Herbert Hoover's library up in Iowa and going at least through every presidential library through Lyndon Johnson, he said, I think you'd find a lot of stuff in presidential papers that has not been redacted by your former employer, the Central Intelligence Agency. So I said, hey, that's a great idea. And that's exactly what I did. I went to Austin, Texas, and Hyde Park, and in some places I camped, and in other places I stayed in a hostel, sleeping in a room with 4 to 6 other guys, but because I like to eat well, you see, and so that's what I did. And so that was the second serendipitous event. And then the third one occurred one day as I was walking out of the Navy Department Library at the end of a day's research. A gentleman coming out of an adjoining building noticed I was walking towards the bus stop, and he said, where are you going? And I told him, and he offered me a ride. Well, he turned out to be a Navy historian who had published a work on naval operations during the Cuban Missile Crisis that had a few pertinent pages on Guantanamo. And he not only offered to give me a copy, but he invited me to use his unclassified files that were in the secure area where he worked. And they contained a lot of information that was most informative that is now in my book. And it would not be there if this chance encounter had never happened. The main argument of my book, briefly stated, is that from 1898 to the present, Guantanamo has endured in large part because it serves both Cuban and American nationalistic purposes that have made it both a point of friction and a point of diplomatic compromise. The longest period of friction began shortly after Fidel Castro came to power and began railing against the U.S. military presence in southeastern Cuba, which at various times he has described as an imperialistic anachronism and as an illegal occupation of Cuban territory. Most students of Latin American history have some knowledge of Castro's hostility towards the base. But what is generally not known is that from the early 1900s to the present, Guantanamo has also been a site for diplomatic accommodation, compromise, and cooperation. The terms dictated by the Platt Amendment only stated that the United States would buy or lease naval or coaling stations, buy or lease them in Cuba. It did not specify the number of such stations nor their locations. That was a matter of negotiated compromise between Cuban President Tomas Estrada Palma and Theodore Roosevelt, that the United States would obtain really only one major naval stations, and that would be Guantanamo, not Havana. Now, obviously, the United States has always had the upper hand in these negotiations. When I say diplomatic compromise, I'm not suggesting that the two parties started on a level playing field. That certainly would not be the case. The second major compromise occurred in 1934 when the United States abrogated the Platt Amendment, which had become increasingly unpopular with various sectors of the Cuban people and also a number of U.S. legislators who thought that Cuban presidents seeking to extend their terms beyond their constitutional limits would manipulate the Platt Amendment to their own advantage. In both 1903 and 1934, the United States, in dictating the terms either of the original lease, which basically said that the United States would occupy Guantanamo and have it so long as military forces were present. If the U.S. military pulled out, it would revert to Cuba, or if by mutual agreement it was decided that the United States would turn the base over, relinquish it to Cuba. And the exact language was, as I said, dictated by Theodore Roosevelt in 1903, and his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, when he abrogated the Platt Amendment, rewrote or reinserted the validity of, or asserted the validity of the lease and used the exact language that Theodore Roosevelt had dictated in 1903. Now, I've passed out some photographs, and there are two photographs of the Guantanamo Bay itself. And if you look at them and you look at small boats in both pictures, you will get some sense of the expanse of this bay. I was in Guantanamo for about 4 days back in 2007 as the guest of the commander of the base, and I could not take a panoramic photograph, nor could I look at the entire expanse of the bay itself. It is huge. Christopher Columbus passed by Guantanamo, I think on his third voyage to this part of the world, and he pronounced it Puerto Grande, large port. And it's huge, and it could easily accommodate for decades the entire United States fleet, and that's what it did. It was the winter quarters for the U.S. fleet for certainly in the 1920s, the 1930s, 40s, and so on. Now, I think it's important for me to note that the United States insistence on acquiring a naval base in Cuba was largely the result of a collaborative effort between Theodore Roosevelt and the foremost naval historian or naval geopolitical theorist of his day, Alfred Thayer Mahan. Both of these gentlemen in the late 19th century dreamed of the Caribbean becoming America's Mediterranean, and they came to visualize Guantanamo as America's Gibraltar. It was Mahan, the naval theorist, who proposed this idea, and Roosevelt, the policymaker, who made it happen. Now, this, of course, was never the dream of Cuban nationalists, nor was it a concession that they freely granted. But most Cuban scholars, interestingly, have been reluctant to criticize Theodore Roosevelt because he fought for Cuban independence and he never sought to annex Cuba or to make it a U.S. colony. And that was in contrast to his close friend Leonard Wood, who was military governor of Cuba and who wanted very much to annex it. It may be partly because of the history of Guantanamo evokes conflicting emotions that most Cubans have been reluctant to write about it. Even in the Spanish literature, there are not that many Cuban histories of Guantanamo. As for American students of Cuban history, until recently, most of them have either ignored Guantanamo or discussed it in terms of the Spanish-American War, the squabbles over the Platt Amendment, as a bone of contention between the United States and Castro, or in its current controversial context as a maximum security prison and interrogation center. Surprisingly, naval historians have frequently ignored it or claim no knowledge of its history. Guantanamo has served U.S. interests in many ways since 1898. It was instrumental in our defeat of the Spanish warships of Admiral Cervera that were bottled inside the harbor of Santiago de Cuba, 45 miles down the coast from Guantanamo. And the U.S. Naval Commander William Sampson, once he realized that Cervera had, for whatever reason, had gone into the port of Santiago de Cuba, ordered a Marine detachment to take Guantanamo, and they took it in an afternoon. And they took it from the sea. And up until at this time in the Marine Corps history, the Marines were perhaps in danger of going out of business, because they really didn't have a very well-developed sense of mission. And most of them at that time were doing guard duty. And amphibious warfare became a new mission for the Marine Corps, and many Marine Corps histories date that sense of amphibious warfare as a mission from Guantanamo. Anyway, Guantanamo is 35 miles east of Santiago de Cuba, and once it was occupied by the U.S. Marine Corps, it became almost immediately a coaling facility and a repair facility there. And what happened was that Sampson was able to impose a naval blockade outside the port of Santiago de Cuba, knowing that Cervera at some point was going to have to come out of that port, and he intended for his ships of the line to blow the Spanish naval detachment to smithereens, which they did. But what would happen is that at night, a lot of ships would leave the blockade, and under the cover of darkness, they would go down the coast to Guantanamo to take on more coal or do any necessary repairs. And for a time, Clara Barton had a hospital ship in Guantanamo during this period. I might point out that the cover of the book shows as an illustration showing the Marines raising the first flag in Cuba at Guantanamo. Well, after we decided that we'd not only taken it, Guantanamo, we would keep it. And the reasoning at that time, I would argue, on the part of people like Theodore Roosevelt and his Secretary of War, Elihu Root, was that Cuba, once independent, would still be very vulnerable to seizure or certainly attack from rapacious European powers, and in particular Imperial Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was looking for his own place in the sun and was certainly interested in the Caribbean. He was also interested in Samoa and the Pacific. And so that, in large part, was, I think, the reason for the Platt Amendment and the insistence in Article 6 of the Platt Amendment that we would either buy or lease coaling stations in Cuba. Over time, it became the winter headquarters for the U.S. fleet, as I said. It was in the darkest days of World War II that Guantanamo provided the greatest service to U.S., Cuban, and Allied interests. In 1942 and for much of 1943, Guantanamo served as the Caribbean hub of an interlocking convoy system that provided protection for Allied shipping, particularly ships, merchant marine ships coming up from places like Aruba and Curacao that were carrying oil or other precious strategic supplies that we wanted to go either to New York or to Halifax to aid the Allied cause. And this sheltering of these merchant marine ships with destroyer escorts and in some cases planes flying overhead turned Guantanamo into the Caribbean hub of this interlocking convoy system, and eventually it persuaded Admiral Donitz of the Third Reich to withdraw his wolf packs back to their home ports in Germany. For a time, Guantanamo was second only to New York as the busiest port in the Western Hemisphere. And because the convoy system worked, strategic wartime materials, not only petroleum but bauxite and sugar, got through to the Allies. And the U.S. military presence in Cuba also deterred the fascists and the Nazis from trying to turn Cuba into a Caribbean version of the Channel Islands. Guantanamo became a flashpoint for Cuban-U.S. animosities toward the end of the Eisenhower administration, when Raul Castro kidnapped and held hostage for a little more than a month 24 U.S. servicemen, including 11 Marines, who were returning to the base from Liberty in Guantanamo City. Now, Raul Castro justified this kidnapping on the basis that the United States had allowed Guantanamo to be used for refueling purposes by Batista, for refueling his military aircraft, and also for transferring arms to Batista's forces after the Eisenhower administration had placed an embargo on all weapons sales to Cuban belligerents. As relations between Washington and Cuba deteriorated following the installation of the revolutionary government, which of course took Havana on January 1st, 1959, Guantanamo was viewed by both Washington and Havana with concern. Castro believed that a U.S. invasion might begin at Guantanamo, and at various times, particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Washington feared that the Cubans, with Soviet encouragement and possible assistance, might attack the base. There was also concern that if the United States ever decided to leave Guantanamo, that it might become a Soviet naval facility. If you look at Cuba, Guantanamo is what I might say describe as strategically positioned to overlook both what is called the Windward Passage between the Caribbean and the Atlantic. It's also a fairly straight shot from Guantanamo down to the Panama Canal, which of course Theodore Roosevelt intended to build. And perhaps equally important, Cuba could provide easy access to one of our major ports, the Port of Louisiana, or you might call it the Port of New Orleans. And I think at various times there was concern that if the Soviets were to, during the Cold War, to take over Guantanamo, the Port of New Orleans would be another region that would be threatened, and our national security concerns would focus on that particular area. Now, there were also instances during this period when senior U.S. military and civilian officials, including Robert Kennedy and General Lemitzer, proposed that deceptive operations might be staged at Guantanamo to justify a full-scale U.S. military invasion to oust the revolutionary government under Fidel Castro. Fortunately, that never happened. Castro's antipathy to Guantanamo is well known. But Guantanamo has also provided Fidel Castro with an anti-American platform that he otherwise would have lacked. It is not really clear that Castro wanted to get us out of Guantanamo by force. He would posture, he would threaten, but he would back down. In the early months of President Lyndon Johnson's administration, when Castro renewed his harassment of base personnel by shutting off the potable water supply, President Johnson and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara retaliated by firing most of the Cuban workers who lived in Cuba but commuted to Guantanamo. When Castro realized he was going to lose considerable foreign exchange as a result of his action, he offered to turn the water back on, an offer that Johnson quickly rejected. What I'd like to do is read two short sections from this book to give you some flavor of what I have written about. Start at the beginning and then go pretty close to the end. Guantanamo Bay lies at the southeastern tip of Cuba, facing the Caribbean. It encompasses a large naval base that occupies an area of approximately 45 square miles of land and water. The bay itself is pouch-shaped. It is about 12 miles long in a northeast-southwest direction and 6 miles across at its greatest width. Ships enter and exit the bay between Leeward Point and Windward Point through a 1 1/4 mile wide channel with a 42-foot dredged depth. Because of its deep draft, length, and width, Guantanamo Bay historically has, as I've said, been able to accommodate a sizable portion of the U.S. Navy fleet at any time. The geographical surrounding has its beautiful aspects. A broad stretch of blue water framed by crescent-shaped shores. But this is an arid section of Cuba, and the hills that hug the coastline are rocky and dotted with scrub trees and bushes. The most compelling description of this tropical setting and its naval activity was written by Navy officer K.C. McIntosh, who conceived the following word picture for the American Mercury during his 7-month assignment to Guantanamo Bay in 1926. And I will quote, "On the steep shores of a ragged inlet, cut through the mangroves, is the naval station. Here are the target ranges and recreation field, the oil tanks, power plant, and storehouses. Along the cliff top, the low green bungalows of the quarters nestle in a tangle of palms and trumpet vines, a flowery oasis in a desert of scrub and thorn. Then the fleet comes steaming in, a long gray line. The stolid battleships drop ponderous anchors near the naval station. Trim, lean cruisers in double row take positions just beyond. And then come the clumsy, squat vessels of the train, store ships, repair ships, and tankers, their gray formation broken by the startling white of the floating hospital. The glassy surface of the bay is crisscrossed with the droning wakes of 100 busy motorboats. Gigs and barges speed back and forth, carrying seniors on official visits. Bong, bong. That's all we'll hear between now and April, yelps a turret officer. Come on, gang, let's go." This evocative portrayal of a bustling but normal day between World War I and World Wars I and II at this naval station should suggest to the reader that imperialism, viewed only as exploitation, fails to capture certain essential qualities of Guantanamo. As the following history of this unique military outpost will illustrate, Guantanamo provides a useful prism through which to view U.S.-Cuban relations from the Spanish-American War to the present. Now, before I read the last brief excerpt, I would like to say that to me one of the most fascinating developments in recent history has been the initiation of the so-called fence line talks in 1996, a diplomatic initiative that continues to this day. It was originally proposed by the Cuban military to reduce accidents and fatalities caused by Haitian refugees trying to escape from Guantanamo through the surrounding minefields, and by Cubans trying to get to Guantanamo from Cuba. Particularly the problem with would-be Cuban refugees, or the United States deciding to repatriate some of these Cubans that it did not want to grant asylum to in the United States. And so the Cubans came to the base, Cuban military, and they said, we need to talk. And these talks began, and they fairly quickly were routinized into a monthly exchange just inside the northeast entrance, the land entrance to the base. And the talks have resulted in a number of things. American planes flying in and out of Guantanamo had to execute a rather dangerous beeline approach from going out over international waters and then making a direct approach in to avoid violating Cuban airspace. And one of the planes had a rough landing and rolled off the runway, and nobody was injured, but it damaged the struts of the plane. After this happened, one of the American negotiators, a senior State Department official, came to one of these meetings and said, would it be possible for us to borrow a quadrant or utilize a quadrant of Cuban airspace? And the military officer, the military commander, said certainly. He said the Cuban government has no interest in U.S. military planes crashing on Cuban soil. And so that was done just like that. Another request, which I think did go to Havana, was for approval, and it was also granted, was the Americans asking if pilots flying in and out of Guantanamo could report oncoming hurricanes or important weather conditions over Cuban air frequencies. That request was also granted. More recently, what has happened is that the whole issue of what would happen if a forest fire were to break out along the fence line came up. And particularly if people fighting the fire on either Cuban or American soldiers were burned. Well, there is no burn unit on the base of Guantanamo, but there is a burn unit at the hospital in Guantanamo City. So the Cubans drove up one day and loaded up the Navy commander on the base, and the senior State Department official took him to Guantanamo City, and they toured the burn unit there, and then they treated them to a big barbecue at a rather interesting. It was at a hotel that actually, a Cuban hotel that actually overlooks the base. And the senior State Department official said to me, he was there at the time, he said, I turned to the Cuban commander and I said, you know, with your binoculars, you could have watched me shaving this morning. So, rather interesting incident. Now, but this is the only place in Cuba where face-to-face diplomacy takes place. And as the Cubans have said, it is precisely here that it is needed because it is here where our militaries confront each other. According to the Cuban government's stated view, that military enclave, Guantanamo, is the exact place where American and Cuban soldiers stand to face, and thus the place where serenity and a sense of responsibility are most required. Consequently, what prevails there today is not what could be described as an atmosphere of hostility or war. That's the official statement of the Cuban government. Even if this were interpreted as propaganda, I think it has been well documented by recent history. And so I'd like to answer or address any questions that you may have. Yes, John.
What's the possibility that those contacts could be broadened and lead to a more substantive discussion of the relationships between the two entities?
Well, I think it would be a great place to begin to move towards a normalization of relations. I think the fact that that mechanism exists, I think that gives both Cuba and the United States a lever that could be used at Guantanamo and used to possibly lead towards a normalization of relations. I just published an op-ed in the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel in which I said that it's pretty clear that the detention center at Guantanamo is going to close long before we decide to pull out of the Navy base itself. But if we were to decide to, we and the Cubans were to decide to move towards a normalization of relations, of course the most likely thing that could happen is that Guantanamo, the base itself, would become a very important bargaining chip in that normalization of relations. And I think it would be most likely that we would turn the base over to the Cubans. I mean, after all, it's on Cuban soil. But I don't think we could propose that now without, in the current environment, without risking political suicide for any politician who would propose it. But I would hope that, personally speaking, that we could end the embargo. I think the embargo, frankly, in my opinion, makes very little sense today. We have normal relations with Vietnam. We have relations with lots of governments that we don't particularly like. And let's face it, the embargo doesn't hurt Raul Castro. It doesn't hurt the senior members of the Cuban military. It doesn't hurt the senior members of the Communist Party. It hurts the man and woman in the street. I have a friend in Havana who teaches at the University of Havana. He makes the equivalent of about $50 a month. And also, just to push this a little bit more, we are increasing our trade with Cuba. Now, it is currently limited to the export of U.S. medical supplies and agricultural goods, but I understand that export figures over the past 2 years have skyrocketed from around 325 million to over 750 million. So I think that things are moving in that direction. But I really think that whatever I have read, and I also know the senior State Department official, in fact, he's the one who took me to Guantanamo, who engages in these fence line talks, I really think that everything I've read about what goes on there just is common sense. It just is I mean, sentries or guards making obscene gestures or firing shots over the fence line, that ended a long time ago. Ever since these talks have begun, if anybody does something like that, they're out of there. They're just pulled out. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I assume you were in the Directorate of Intelligence.
I was,
and
for the most part, yeah.
Fundamentally, you were overt.
Yes, I was overt.
Where, you know, I'm not all that familiar with some things in South America. Can you tell me, basically, were you in North South America or in the southern section?
Well, actually, as an analyst with the CIA, I worked on every country in, I worked on the Caribbean, I worked on Central America, I worked on Mexico, I worked on South America. The one country I never worked on was Cuba.
That was a monopoly.
That's right, that's right. But I was the Caribbean analyst for, and particularly Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Jamaica and so on for a while. And then I was chief of the Andean branch, and then I worked on Argentina and lived in Argentina, and I've also lived in Brazil. So.
You were involved with Venezuela?
Yes, yes, to some extent, yeah. Mm-hmm. You want to follow up?
I didn't know that you covered all of South America.
As I was a regional analyst. Let me say a few words, since you mentioned Venezuela, about Hugo Chavez. And what I'm going to say may sound a little radical for what most people think a CIA analyst would think. A few years ago, I read a book by a diplomatic historian about Latin America, a fellow named Mark Gilderhus, and he made an assertion that I actually agree with. And he said that ever since the end of the 19th century up to the present, when the United States wanted something from Latin America, and it didn't get it by asking for it nicely, it tended to get nasty. I can think of a lot of cases in which that happened. And so the appearance from time to time on the scene of people like Hugo Chavez or Juan Perón at certain times, or other Latin American populist leaders, I think is the payback that we've gotten for having a big stick policy towards this region. I'm not exactly sure how quickly and why we developed this hegemonic approach or attitude, and I think it really did begin in the late 19th century, because before that, although we were interested in Latin America, it may have actually begun to some extent, it may have been a sort of a foreshadowing of that in the Monroe Doctrine, of course written by John Quincy Adams. But I think in terms of, it seems to have been a kind of a sort of an approach that we have often taken. That said, I do think that Hugo Chavez is probably not, and I may be wrong in this prediction, but I don't think he's going to be around all that much longer, because he's spending himself into a predictable financial crisis. He is so much in favor of populist policies that address the needs of the poor, and that's certainly not a bad thing at all. But by making enemies of major lenders and turning to governments like Iran and North Korea, he's dealing with problems of debt and inflation, and I think he's not bright enough, frankly, to get himself out of the fix he's putting himself in. But also, I would have to say that there are a number of countries in Latin America that do not share Chavez's views, either towards the United States or the rest of the world. Certainly, the government in Peru doesn't. The government of Mexico doesn't. And while Brazil, under Lula, has to deal to some extent with Venezuela because it's close by, I certainly think that actually Lula da Silva is a wonderful president for Brazil. I think he has put his country on a path that is leading it to becoming one of the great powers of the future. Other questions? Yes?
I was wondering if in your opinion, you believe that Guantanamo is strategically important to our military today?
No, not right now. Since the 1970s and 80s, Guantanamo has become primarily a Coast Guard facility, and there also is a place there. It's no longer called Immigration and Naturalization Service, but CSIS, I guess it is. And they process people there who want asylum. However, there are plans underway to expand the Panama Canal so that it can accommodate much larger ships than it has been able to, of course, with the development of very large battleships and aircraft carriers and freighters and so on. Assuming that expansion of the Panama Canal takes place, once it's completed, then Guantanamo might assume a kind of a strategic significance that it hasn't had in recent decades. And, I think that right now, today, Guantanamo is proving its worth, once again, as a deployment center and as a place to take people who can be rescued out of Haiti who need medical attention. And I think that's, you know, something that may certainly put a more positive spin on the image that Guantanamo will have than it has had in recent years. Yes?
What would you see as Cuba's political and economic future after Fidel passes? I mean, if you were projecting into the future.
Well, I think that Raul, there's some evidence that Raul Castro would like to increase commercial ties with the United States. And people have suggested that he would like to sort of deal with the United States in a way similar to the way mainland China deals with the United States. The problem is that, of course, you don't have human rights, a very good human rights record in Cuba, and at least from the U.S. perspective, and you certainly don't have democratic elections. And I would say the most powerful organizations in Cuba right now are the Cuban Communist Party and still the Cuban military. Cuban generals have made millions of dollars off of the recent increase in the tourist trade to Cuba. And I'm not sure, or I certainly don't think that those groups want to see a normalization of relations with the United States that would in any way threaten their position. But once the Castros have gone from the scene, events may very well force their hand or just simply be too powerful for them to fight. Who knows? I mean, you know, I don't have any better crystal ball than anybody else, but I really do think that there are lots of people who would like to make money in Cuba. And that capitalist incentive, I think over time will become even more powerful. Other questions? Yes, Richard.
How do you foresee the possibility that the Cuban hierarchy in the Communist Party and the Army might emerge as the new capitalist elite in Cuba?
That's an interesting thought. I don't know. Sure, it's that could happen. But what I'm wondering about is the American political side of that equation. And you and my friend John Roach might be able to speak more about that than I can. I don't know.
Well, I mean, that's the Chinese model.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
And I don't, you know, we've certainly worked out a modus vivendi with China. I don't see any great distinction and certainly with the Cuban thing, it's a lot simpler because it's a much less powerful interlocutor.
And once Fidel and Raul have departed from the scene, a lot of animosity that Cuban Americans have felt towards the revolution will abate or disappear. And I would suggest that is already abating because now you're talking about people who are, yes, the children or grandchildren of the Cubans who fled Cuba to the United States in 1959, 1960, and 1961, but that generation has gray hair, if they're still around, and they're not as dynamic or as influential as the new generation. And you know, I have some students at the University of Alabama who are grandchildren of Cuban refugees. And what they know, and what I try to do is get them to, when they want to write topics on the Caribbean, I teach a course in Caribbean history, I try to get them to go and interview their grandmother or their grandfather, or if they're still alive, and find out what it was like for them to come to the United States, because they really don't know much of that history, and, unless they're forced to learn about it. So, other?
If I might, one more about your book. Somewhere along about chapter 4, maybe, chapter 3, you allude to periods that were teetering on the brink of rebellion in Cuba and outbreak of guerrilla war in the years following the treaty.
Mm-hmm.
And you indicate indirectly that there might have been a racial component to that. I believe at one point you indicate that the fear was that in Washington was that there'd be more of a likelihood of an outbreak among the former slaves in Cuba.
Well, you know, there's a new book that's come out. I don't think it's a particularly good book, but it's called The Imperial Cruise, I believe. It's about the trip that Theodore Roosevelt sent his daughter Alice on, along with William Howard Taft. And that book, of course, points out that Theodore Roosevelt was a man of his time, and that he had strong racial feelings of prejudice towards the Cubans who fought with American forces in 1898. And my own view is, on the basis of having read this and done this research, is that we would not have won the war in Cuba in such a short time had it not been for the intelligence provided by the Cuban volunteers, who knew exactly where the Spanish were, who fought alongside the Americans. And, you know, Americans who died in Cuba during the War of 1898, a number of them got Congressional Medals of Honor. They were sort of being handed out like hotcakes posthumously. And almost all of them got military burials. The Cubans were buried where they fell. In some cases, if they were near their local villages, people might come out and reclaim the bodies, but they ordinarily were buried in ditches, and they have no names. Yes, there were a number of people in that era of Theodore Roosevelt, Leonard Wood, and others who really didn't appreciate or give any sign of full appreciation for the service that the Cubans had provided. I mean, after all, the Cubans had been fighting since 1895. We get into the war in 1898. The Cubans had been there for 3 years, and they had also fought an unsuccessful war known as the 10 Years' War. So they knew a lot. They knew a lot about guerrilla fighting. They knew about tactics. And Cuban leaders, Maximo Gomez and Calixto Garcia, were denied participation in the victory celebrations at the end of the war. This was grist for people like Fidel Castro to seize upon and to make Guantanamo, and not just Guantanamo, but the whole U.S. intervention in their struggle for independence an object of nationalistic hatred. So be it. I think it's a very sad part of that history. But, in the year 2009, I'm obviously enlightened, right? Other questions or comments? I think there's I try to be as balanced as I can in this research. It makes it a lot more fun. Did I answer your question?
You did. good, thank you.
Anybody else? Yes,
I want to
Diane.
mention the Cuba initiative at the University of Alabama. It's unique.
Oh yeah, and I was a recipient of that. Well, actually there are other programs now, but what has happened is that the University of Alabama and the University of Havana have an agreement, which they've had now for many years, that is sanctioned by law, and American researchers go to Cuba, archaeologists, anthropologists, economists, and in addition, and Cubans come to the United States, assuming their government will allow them to come here. There was a Cuba conference that was held at the University of Alabama now about 6 years ago. And every spring, a number of students from the University of Alabama go and study for a semester in Cuba. The whole idea behind this is building bridges towards the future. And I think it's wonderful. I think that it is something that more schools should become involved in, because I think that it just makes sense. And you know, people talking to each other, that's why I like the fence line talks. You get people, even people who are have inimical relations, if you get them to talk together on a regular basis, they learn to understand each other, and they may even become friends. What's the harm in that? None. Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Stephen Schwab is a former senior analyst for the CIA's South America Division. He currently teaches history at the University of Alabama. For more information, visit left-bank.com.